Throughout the vast, sweeping narrative of human history, where hundreds of billions of souls have walked the earth, only a select few have managed to shatter the boundaries of time and achieve true immortality. Among them stands a figure who remains perhaps the most polarizing, mesmerizing, and fiercely debated individual to ever command the global stage, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not merely a historical character, he was a seismic phenomenon. In fact, historical data ranking the most influential figures of all time places him second only to Jesus Christ, standing even above the Prophet Muhammad. Such is the terrifying, colossal scale of this single man's legacy. Today, modern consensus remembers Napoleon primarily as a military titan, an unrivaled genius who commanded over 80 major battles, emerging victorious in 90% of them. This is a staggering statistical reality that no other commander in human history has ever replicated. He fundamentally reinvented the mechanics of modern warfare, permanently rewriting the architecture of military strategy. Yet, behind the pristine myth of the indomitable conqueror lies a labyrinth of bizarre paradoxes and historical ironies. Did you know that the man celebrated as the greatest French hero in history could not even speak a single word of French until the age of 10? Or that as a young man, he came perilously close to abandoning his military uniform entirely to pursue a career as a tragic romance novelist? And that is merely the visible tip of a massive psychological iceberg. When he was not busy bending continental Europe to his absolute will, Napoleon somehow found the luxury of time to orchestrate the single largest real estate transaction in human history. Inadvertently, hand human civilization the key to unlocking ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and draft a framework of legal, economic, and educational systems that continue to govern the modern world today. His life was an epic, high-stakes cinematic drama, and today we will step directly into his raw, unvarnished reality. Our story begins on August 15, 1769, on the rugged, windswept island of Corsica. To call this a French island at the time is historically deceptive. Merely 3 months before Napoleon drew his first breath, Corsica was a sovereign, fiercely independent republic. The French crown had essentially purchased the island from its previous masters, the Republic of Genoa, and immediately launched a brutal invasion to consolidate control. Naturally, the local populace reacted with armed fury. Napoleon's parents, despite his mother being 6 months pregnant with him at the time, actively embedded themselves in the Corsican resistance, fighting a bloody, desperate guerrilla war against the invading French forces. While mainstream history books often point to the Siege of Toulon as Napoleon's first true engagement, a deeper psychological truth suggests his first battle was fought while he was still inside the womb. It was an initial, crushing defeat. France was the wealthiest, most heavily populated superpower in Europe, and the isolated Corsican rebels never stood a chance. Yet, the embers of anti-French resentment burned fiercely within the local population, and most intensely within the young, observant mind of Napoleon. Consequently, at the tender age of 9, he felt a profound sense of betrayal when his father packed him off to an elite French boarding school on the mainland. It was a jarring, alien world, and Napoleon detested every agonizing second of it. Culturally and emotionally, he was an outsider. He did not speak French. His native tongue was a distinct blend of Corsican and Italian. Though he weaponized his intellect to master the new language with astonishing speed, he would carry a thick, heavily mocked Corsican accent for the remainder of his life. A year later, he secured a prestigious scholarship to the military academy at Brienne-le-Château, a sanctuary that quickly transformed into another theater of isolation. His aristocratic classmates were the pampered sons of the high French nobility. Though Napoleon stemmed from a minor line of Corsican aristocracy, his family was functionally broke. He was relentlessly bullied, targeted for his background, his financial standing, and his foreign accent. Yet this crushing loneliness did not break him. It forged an impenetrable iron will and a suffocating, hyper-focused ambition inside the teenage outcast. At age 16, Napoleon graduated from the military academy, receiving his commission as a second lieutenant in an elite artillery unit. He was an insatiable student of logistics and mathematics, rapidly establishing himself as the most capable officer in his regiment. But the swift advancement his intellect earned him was systematically blocked. Pre-revolutionary French society was anchored to a rigid, decaying caste system. To reach the upper echelons of military command, talent was irrelevant. One required a high, noble pedigree. No matter how ruthlessly he worked or how brilliant his strategic designs were, Napoleon was destined to remain permanently capped by the circumstances of his birth, or so he believed. Because just as his ambitions seemed doomed to stagnation, a political cataclysm of apocalyptic proportions erupted across France. It was a societal earthquake that would not only shatter the monarchy, but tear down the old world entirely, carving open a bloody, chaotic path for a brilliant, opportunistic artillery officer. History was turning its page, and it was screaming the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French Revolution exploded with unprecedented fury. The ancient feudal hierarchy that had dominated France for centuries was violently dismantled as radical revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy, stripping the aristocracy of their historical privileges. King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, were systematically executed by the guillotine, and France was proclaimed a republic governed by the volatile whims of an elected assembly. As news of this radical shift metastasized across Europe, neighboring empires watched with absolute terror. The crowned heads of Europe recognized that these infectious revolutionary ideals posed an existential threat to their own thrones. Rather than negotiating, Europe's monarchs chose the language they understood best: absolute war. Great Britain, the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, Prussia, Sardinia, and Spain forged a massive, unprecedented military coalition designed to crush the young French Republic out of existence. The War of the First Coalition had begun. To an ordinary citizen, facing an invasion by half the European continent was terrifying. But to Napoleon Bonaparte, this global chaos was a divine invitation. The sudden, desperate flight of noble officers left the French military facing a catastrophic shortage of competent leadership. Ancestry no longer mattered. Raw merit was the only currency that carried value. Napoleon's definitive moment arrived in 1793, after royalist rebels, heavily reinforced by British and Spanish naval fleets, seized the critical Mediterranean port city of Toulon. At just 24 years old, Napoleon was tasked with directing the artillery. He immediately identified the strategic fracture in the enemy's position, engineering a bold, high-risk operational plan. He proposed launching a midnight assault to capture a heavily fortified hilltop overlooking the harbour. Once the heights were secured, he would turn the captured cannons directly onto the Allied fleets anchored below, forcing them into a bottleneck trap. Napoleon personally led the bayonet charge into the teeth of the enemy fire, taking a severe wound to his thigh in the process. His execution was flawless. The Allied fleets were forced into a chaotic retreat. Toulon fell back into Republican hands, and the global military establishment received its first terrifying glimpse of history's greatest practical mastermind. Following this triumph, Napoleon was immediately promoted to brigadier general. Yet, just as his grandest military dreams seemed within reach, his career suffered a sudden, humiliating derailment. He was reassigned to a mundane command tasked with brutally suppressing an internal civil uprising in western France. Viewing the assignment as beneath his operational genius, Napoleon chose to exploit a common bureaucratic loophole. He feigned a debilitating illness. Stranded in Paris without an active command, his frustration led him to an unexpected, highly dramatic career pivot. He sat down and penned a deeply emotional, melodramatic romance novella featuring a tragic protagonist who bore an unmistakable resemblance to Napoleon himself. The revolutionary government, unimpressed by his literary ambitions and his defiance of orders, promptly struck his name from the list of active generals. In an instant, his meteoric military career appeared to be finished before it had truly begun. But destiny intervened once more in October of 1795, when a massive wave of 25,000 armed royalist insurgents launched a coordinated catastrophic assault on Paris. Their objective was singular: overthrow the revolutionary government and restore the Bourbon monarchy. Inside the capital, the Republican defenders were outnumbered 5-1, entirely disorganized and utterly devoid of competent leadership. In a panic, The desperate government remembered the young, unemployed artillery specialist who happened to be wandering the streets of Paris. The fate of the entire republic was thrust into Napoleon's hands. He agreed to defend the government on one absolute condition: he must be granted complete, unrestricted operational command. The terms were accepted. Napoleon had fewer than 24 hours to prepare his defenses, but he used every single minute with ruthless efficiency. He deployed his troops at critical choke points in the narrow streets surrounding the Tuileries Palace, positioning heavy artillery to create overlapping fields of fire. As the royalist masses surged forward on the morning of October 5th, Napoleon did not hesitate. He ordered his gunners to fire point-blank into the dense crowds using grape shot, a lethal, devastating ammunition that transformed heavy cannons into massive shotguns. Napoleon stood directly on the front line, maintaining perfect tactical composure even after his own horse was shot out from under him. The devastating crossfire tore the insurgent ranks to pieces within hours. The rebellion was utterly crushed at the cost of fewer than 100 Republican soldiers. With what he famously described as a whiff of grape shot, the Romance novelist had transformed overnight into the absolute savior of the French Revolution. At age 26, a grateful government rewarded Napoleon with absolute command of the French army of Italy. When he arrived to inspect his new forces in March of 1796, the reality was grim. Of the 13 field armies fielded by France, the army of Italy was the undisputed bottom of the barrel. His soldiers were severely malnourished, missing basic uniforms, and had not received a single franc of pay in months. Morale had evaporated. Mutiny was brewing across multiple regiments. Out of 63,000 men on paper, only 38,000 were physically capable of marching into battle. Facing them across the rugged Italian landscape was a massive, highly disciplined alliance of Austrian and Sardinian forces. Napoleon looked at this broken rabble and engineered an astonishing logistical resurrection. Within an unimaginable 2 weeks, he transformed a mutinous crowd into a hyper-efficient precision war machine. He immediately went on the offensive, striking the Allied armies before they could consolidate their numbers. In his first official engagement as a supreme commander, he completely isolated and decimated a combined Austro-Sardinian force west of Genoa, inflicting thousands of casualties while losing only 200 of his own men. Over the next 12 months, Napoleon conducted a campaign that defied all established rules of European warfare. Outnumbered and facing veteran generals on unfamiliar terrain, his speed and audacity paralyzed his opponents. He won 19 out of 21 major battles. The Allied forces were so comprehensively outmaneuvered that they were forced to beg for peace, surrendering total control of northern Italy to France. Napoleon single-handedly dictated the terms of the Treaty of Campo Formio, effectively ending the War of the First Coalition. Of all France's original adversaries, only one colossal enemy remained undefeated: Great Britain. Napoleon meticulously analyzed the logistics of a direct cross-channel invasion of England. His clinical conclusion was stark. Without a massive naval fleet capable of challenging the absolute supremacy of the British Royal Navy, an invasion would result in catastrophic failure. He needed an alternative strategy to cripple his rival. He decided to strike an indirect, devastating blow by targeting Egypt. To the untrained eye, invading Egypt seemed eccentric, but Napoleon's design was deeply calculated. Great Britain's economic bloodstream was anchored to its colonial empire in India. British merchant ships were forced to navigate all the way around Africa to access the subcontinent, but their critical communications and fast courier routes cut directly through the Middle East via Egypt. By conquering Egypt, Napoleon would systematically sever Britain's primary economic artery, while simultaneously establishing a strategic staging ground for a future French thrust into India. When he pitched the plan to the French government, they approved it with suspicious enthusiasm. The truth was, Napoleon had become a victim of his own staggering success. He was now an untouchable national hero, and his immense popularity posed an unspoken, existential threat to the fragile politicians in power. Fearing a military coup, the government recognized that sending this hyper-ambitious young general to the deserts of North Africa for a year or two was the perfect mechanism to safeguard their own power, while simultaneously inflicting damage on the British. On May 19, 1798, Napoleon's massive invasion armada, carrying 40,000 highly trained troops, set sail for the Mediterranean. Crucially, these warships carried an extraordinary cargo. Napoleon had recently been elected to the prestigious National Institute of France, and he was determined to frame his military conquest as a grand expedition of scientific enlightenment. To achieve this, he brought along nearly 200 of France's top scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and cartographers. The fleet landed in Egypt in July, quickly securing Alexandria before marching half the force across the scorching desert towards Cairo. There, silhouetted against the horizon near the ancient pyramids, 40,000 elite Ottoman and Mamluk soldiers stood waiting for them. The Ottoman commanders, possessing a 2-to-1 numerical superiority, were entirely confident in an easy victory over the foreign invaders. They had no idea they were about to clash with a tactical genius who had permanently altered the rules of war. The resulting engagement, famously known as the Battle of the Pyramids, would go down as one of the most structurally lopsided victories in the history of global conflict. Facing relentless, terrifying charges from the legendary Mamluk cavalry, Napoleon calmly introduced a revolutionary tactical innovation. He arranged his infantry regiments into massive, hollow, multi-layered defensive squares. These human fortresses presented an impenetrable wall of bayonets and concentrated musket fire from every single angle. The Mamluk cavalry broke themselves against the French lines. At the astonishingly low cost of only 289 French lives, over 10,000 Ottoman soldiers were eradicated. Cairo fell, and Egypt belonged to Napoleon. But his triumph evaporated almost instantly. The British government had been hunting for his armada, and they dispatched their most ruthless naval commander, Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson, to neutralize the threat. On August 1st, Nelson caught the French fleet anchored defenselessly in Aboukir Bay. The resulting naval battle was a catastrophic absolute annihilation of the French fleet. In a single night, Napoleon's entire naval infrastructure was erased from the Mediterranean, leaving his victorious army permanently stranded and isolated in North Africa. Yet, while Napoleon was tactically trapped, his army of scientists was busy executing one of the greatest intellectual breakthroughs in human history. While reconstructing the defensive fortifications of Fort Julien near the city of Reshaped, French soldiers unearthed a massive, unusual slab of grenadierite covered in 3 distinct bands of ancient script. This artifact, rechristened as the Rosetta Stone, contained the exact same decree written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, Demotic script, and ancient Greek. It would ultimately serve as the definitive mathematical key to deciphering the long-lost language of the pharaohs, single-handedly birthing the modern science of Egyptology. As months turned into a year, Napoleon realized his military position in Egypt was a dead end. Casualties from disease and guerrilla warfare were mounting, and he was entirely cut off from supplies. More critically, his intelligence network informed him that back in Paris, the political structure was disintegrating into total chaos. Sensing a historic power vacuum, Napoleon made a ruthless, highly controversial decision. In the dead of night, he abandoned his army in Egypt, slipped past the British naval blockades on a solitary small frigate, and sailed back to France without saying a single word of farewell to his men. He arrived in Paris in October of 1799, stepping directly into a nation on the brink of collapse. The monarchies of Europe, learning that France's premier general was trapped in Egypt, had immediately launched a new offensive, triggering the War of the Second Coalition. Deprived of Napoleon's tactical leadership, the French armies suffered devastating defeats on multiple fronts. The public was furious, and the corrupt government was collapsing under the weight of its own incompetence. Napoleon's primary strength on the battlefield had always been his ability to exploit the structural weaknesses of his enemies. It turned out he was equally adept at exploiting the political fractures of his friends. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon orchestrated a flawless clinical coup d'état. He overthrew the legislature, dissolved the government, and established a new authoritarian regime known as the Consulate, appointing himself first consul and absolute ruler of France. The French Revolution was officially dead. In place of a hereditary king, France now possessed a military dictator with absolute centralized power. His first order of business was to systematically crush the Second Coalition. While he had been away in Africa, Austrian forces had reclaimed northern Italy. The world assumed that as the political ruler of France, Napoleon would remain in Paris and delegate the bloody work of combat to his subordinates. Instead, he executed another operational shockwave. He personally led a massive army through the treacherous frozen winter passes of the Swiss Alps, completely blindsiding a significantly larger Austrian force. Within weeks, he secured a series of devastating victories, collapsing the Second Coalition entirely. Even Great Britain was forced to sign a peace treaty. For the first time in over 10 consecutive years, continental Europe experienced absolute peace. With no active battlefields to manage, Napoleon redirected his immense executive intellect towards civilian infrastructure. During this brief window of peace, he executed a domestic revolution that completely modernized French society. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, a monumental, unified framework that completely overhauled and standardized civil law for the first time in French history, establishing principles of legal equality and property rights that would become the blueprint for modern legal systems worldwide. He completely overhauled the education sector, creating a highly structured network of secondary schools. He established the Central Bank of France to stabilize the currency and completely redesigned the tax system, pulling the nation out of economic bankruptcy. Yet this domestic golden age concealed a dark, deeply tragic undercurrent. Nearly all of Napoleon's celebrated legal reforms applied exclusively to men. Under his code, women were systematically stripped of the fundamental legal and financial rights they had briefly secured during the Revolution, placing them under the total legal dominance of their husbands. More appallingly, Napoleon chose to resurrect a horrific institution. The French Revolution had proudly abolished slavery across all French colonies, declaring that all human beings were inherently free. But Napoleon, desperate to fund his grand colonial ambitions in the New World, quietly re-established slavery in the French Caribbean, triggering a brutal, bloody conflict in Saint-Domingue. To the French populace, however, Napoleon was a domestic deity who could do no wrong. In 1802, a national referendum overwhelmingly confirmed his promotion to first consul for life. That same year, finding himself strapped for cash to prepare for the inevitable resumption of hostilities with Britain, he engaged in a monumental piece of real estate speculation. He sold over 800,000 square miles of North American territory to the young United States government for $15 million. This transaction, known as the Louisiana Purchase, instantly doubled the physical size of the United States, permanently shifting the geopolitical trajectory of the globe. By 1803, the fragile peace shattered, and Great Britain officially declared war, initiating the War of the Third Coalition. Napoleon, having survived over 30 distinct, highly coordinated assassination plots, recognized that his life was a fragile shield for France. The title of consul for life was no longer enough to secure his long-term legacy. He required a supreme status that would anchor his family line to the absolute bedrock of European legitimacy. On December 2nd, 1804, inside the historic walls of Notre Dame Cathedral, amidst one of the most opulent grand spectacles ever recorded in human history, Napoleon Bonaparte reached into his destiny. In a deliberate, deeply symbolic act of defiance that shocked the religious establishment, he bypassed the Pope, took the imperial crown with his own two hands, and placed it firmly upon his own head, declaring himself Emperor of the French. His new title did not technically expand his domestic authority, which was already absolute, but it broadcast an unmistakable message to the royal dynasties of Europe. A new imperial lineage had arrived, and it was entirely prepared to dominate the world. As successive waves of European coalitions, the Third, the Fourth, and the Fifth, rose in desperate attempts to dethrone him, Napoleon systematically dismantled them with terrifying ease. To sustain a total war across an entire continent, he pioneered the concept of mass conscription, transforming the entire French population into a human reservoir for his military. At its absolute zenith, his Grand Armée numbered over 600,000 highly disciplined soldiers, a colossal force that dwarfed any contemporary military power. Managing an army of this magnitude in an era before telecommunications was an administrative impossibility for traditional militaries. To solve this logistical nightmare, Napoleon engineered a structural masterpiece, the permanent army corps system. He divided his massive military into self-contained independent mini-armies. Each corps possessed its own infantry, cavalry, artillery, and logistical support, commanded by a trusted marshal. These separate units could march along entirely independent routes, spreading the burden of supply, but could converge with absolute precision within hours of a combat order. The result was a military force that moved with a speed, fluidity, and unpredictable flexibility that paralyzed his opponents. Continental Europe was utterly defenseless against his operational genius. During his imperial reign, Napoleon completely dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, a colossal dynasty that had endured for over 1,000 years. He crushed the mighty Austrian Empire no fewer than 4 times, consistently emerging victorious in battles where his forces were severely outnumbered and outgunned. By 1812, the French Empire stood as the undisputed master of Europe, its borders stretching across the continent, with Napoleon's siblings positioned as puppet monarchs on foreign thrones from Spain to Italy. Yet, 2 nations remained stubbornly outside his imperial grasp: Great Britain and Russia. In 1805, his old nemesis from the Nile, Admiral Horatio Nelson, executed a definitive naval victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, permanently destroying the combined French and Spanish fleets. This loss effectively killed any hope of a French cross-channel invasion of England. Deprived of a naval option, Napoleon chose to redirect his terrifying military weight toward the east, focusing his absolute attention on Russia. On June 24, 1812, a colossal force of over 500,000 soldiers crossed the Russian frontier. The Russian commanders, acutely aware of Napoleon's flawless record of operational annihilation, made a highly strategic decision. They absolutely refused to engage him in a decisive, pitched battle. They recognized that on a field of conflict, this man was fundamentally invincible. Instead, they executed a ruthless, coordinated strategy of total scorched earth retreat. As the Russian armies pulled back deeper into their massive, sprawling territory, they systematically incinerated everything of value before the advancing French could capture it. Entire cities, agricultural fields, livestock, and critical transport corridors were reduced to ash. Napoleon's complex logistical lines were stretched to their absolute breaking point, forced to carry food and ammunition across thousands of miles of devastated, empty landscape. The grandest army the world had ever seen was marching directly into a colossal geographic trap, a vast frozen void that would slowly swallow the emperor's grandest ambitions and signal the definitive beginning of his end. The summer of 1812 was plagued by an unusual oppressive heatwave. Combined with brutal forced marches across a barren wasteland and a catastrophic shortage of clean water, disease began to ravage the French ranks. Soldiers recruited from the conquered territories began to desert by the tens of thousands. By the time the Russian army finally turned to stand and fight at the bloody Battle of Borodino, Napoleon's numerical advantage had evaporated. Though Napoleon secured a technical victory, the cost in French blood was horrific. The triumph allowed Napoleon to march into Moscow, achieving what conventional military wisdom deemed impossible: the capture of the Russian capital. But Napoleon quickly discovered a devastating reality. No one had informed the Russians that they were defeated. He sat inside the Kremlin, patiently waiting for Tsar Alexander to send an envoy to beg for peace. No envoy ever arrived. Instead, mysterious fires erupted across the city, reducing Moscow's wooden architecture to a charred ruin. Napoleon was stranded in a ruined city, 1,000 miles from his supply bases, with his battered army surrounded by hostile forces. As weeks bled into November, the terrifying reality of his mistake became undeniable. The Russian winter had arrived with unprecedented severity. Realizing that remaining in Moscow meant absolute starvation, Napoleon finally ordered a full retreat. It was a catastrophic march through hell. His soldiers were entirely unequipped for the sub-zero Arctic temperatures. Hordes of men froze to death in their sleep. Typhus and starvation liquidated entire regiments. To complete the nightmare, swift groups of Russian Cossacks launched relentless, devastating guerrilla ambushes against the freezing, retreating columns. Of the 500,000 proud soldiers who had marched across the border in June, a tragic, broken remnant of barely 40,000 men crawled out of Russia alive. The myth of Napoleon's absolute invincibility was permanently shattered. Sensing that the Titan was finally vulnerable, the European powers instantly mobilized the Sixth Coalition, uniting Prussia, Russia, Austria, Sweden, and Great Britain in a massive, coordinated effort to finish him. Napoleon surged back to Paris, deploying his executive genius to miraculously conjure a new army of 350,000 men, but these forces were primarily young, untrained teenagers. Despite his tactical brilliance, yielding a few final stunning victories against the Allied advance, the sheer numerical weight of the coalition was unstoppable. Following a massive, bloody defeat at the Battle of Leipzig, Napoleon was cornered. His own marshals refused to fight on, forcing him to officially abdicate the imperial throne in April of 1814. In a display of calculated disrespect mixed with historical irony, the victorious Allies exiled him to Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean, granting him the hollow title of Emperor of Elba. True to his hyperactive psychological code, Napoleon refused to sit idle. Within a mere 9 months, he completely overhauled Elba's infrastructure, constructing a miniature military, a small navy, building public roads, introducing modern agricultural techniques, and rewriting the island's legal system. But a man who had held the keys to continental Europe could never be contained by a tiny Mediterranean island. The caged lion was merely monitoring the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment to break free from his cage. On March 1st, 1815, leading a minuscule force of barely 700 loyal soldiers, Napoleon slipped past his British guards, escaped Elba, and landed on the southern coast of France. Nominally, a force of 700 men posed zero threat to a restored French kingdom, now governed by King Louis XVIII. The king immediately dispatched a veteran royal army of several thousand men to intercept and neutralize the exile. It proved to be a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. The royal soldiers sent to arrest Napoleon were the exact same veteran troops who had bled for him on 100 battlefields. As the two forces confronted one another in a tense standoff, Napoleon calmly stepped out in front of his lines, uncovered his chest, and addressed the royal musketeers. "If there is any soldier among you who wishes to shoot his emperor, here I am." The response was instantaneous. The royal regiments broke into tears, threw down their weapons, shouted, "Long live the emperor!" and immediately defected to their old commander. Napoleon's tiny force transformed into a massive avalanche as it marched toward Paris. King Louis XVIII frantically dispatched a second, even larger army, which promptly defected as well. Realizing his position was completely untenable, the king fled across the border, and on March 20th, 1815, Napoleon marched into Paris at the head of a massive, resurrected military. Without firing a single shot, the emperor had reclaimed his empire. The monarchies of Europe reacted with immediate, absolute fury. They declared Napoleon an international outlaw and forged the Seventh Coalition, mobilizing millions of troops to crush France once and for all. Napoleon knew he was facing a race against time. He could either wait to be invaded by a massive multinational army or launch a preemptive strike to divide his enemies. He chose to attack. He drove his newly assembled army north into Belgium, successfully executing his classic strategic maneuver, positioning his forces directly between the advancing British army and the Prussian military, preventing them from linking their numbers. He struck the Prussians first, inflicting a severe defeat and forcing them into a retreat. He then turned his absolute attention toward the British forces, who had managed to secure a strong defensive position near the small town of Waterloo, commanded by the Duke of Wellington. The Battle of Waterloo was an agonizing, brutally close conflict. Wellington's British lines held their ground with immense, stubborn resilience against waves of devastating French infantry and cavalry assaults. This desperate British stand bought just enough critical time for the broken Prussian army to execute a miraculous tactical rally. They surged onto Napoleon's exposed right flank late in the afternoon, shattering the French lines and plunging the Grande Armée into a chaotic, absolute rout. the final gamble had failed. This time, the Allies were determined to ensure that Napoleon Bonaparte would never return to plague the peace of the world. They bypassed nearby islands and exiled him to Saint Helena, a barren volcanic rock anchored in the absolute isolation of the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from any continent. His epic era of global conquest was permanently over. Napoleon lived out his remaining years under heavy British guard on St. Helena, passing away on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. Though he died in obscure exile, his phantom architecture continues to dictate the literal texture of modern civilization. His revolutionary concepts of military organization, his standardized legal structures, and his institutional overhauls remain embedded in the global fabric. Historians will forever debate the moral architecture of his soul, whether he was a ruthless tyrant who bathed a continent in blood to satisfy a colossal ego, or a tragic hero who defended the progressive ideals of the Enlightenment against the forces of old-world absolute monarchy. But his peerless intellect remains an unassailable historical fact. Years after his definitive defeat at Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington was asked to name the single greatest military commander of any era, past, present, or future. Wellington's answer was elegantly simple, completely devoid of political bias. In this age, in past ages, in any age, Napoleon.